Amid a fire-ravaged landscape once occupied by an opulent ancient Egyptian temple, a group of archaeologists are hard at work. Over time, their careful and considered approach to the excavations reveals something rather odd. Two strange figures sit at rest here, but what are they? They look almost like animals, but not like any alive today. Workers excavating an Egyptian temple discovered strange shapes lurking within. The archaeologists have been working at a temple complex known as Kamela Hetton. During its heyday many thousands of years ago, this place was probably one of the most spectacular structures on Earth. Eventually, though, time, intruders and the elements have combined to fade some of the site's former glories. Natural disasters took their toll on Kamela Hetton, with seismic activity, flooding, and fires all contributing to the site's eventual disintegration. Man also played a hand in the temple's decline. Subsequent rulers of ancient Egypt ransacked stone from the site for building materials for new constructions of their own. Over time, large parts of what's left came to be concealed by foliage. By the contemporary period, archaeologists were under the impression that most of Kamela Hetton had been lost forever. They thought time had done its work on the site, and nothing significant would ever be recovered from there ever again. As things turned out, they were wrong about that. In 1996, a wildfire spread through the site, damaging many of the stones that had been left visible on the surface. That disaster prompted archaeologists to step up their efforts to explore the place, which was a consequential decision. With a little more work, it became clear that this site still held more secrets than had initially been thought. The site has proved to remain a treasure trove of ancient artifacts, with many new discoveries brought to the surface in recent years. Even in 2022, the finds continue to come. In January, for instance, word started to spread about these weird shapes found in the complex. Year by year, our knowledge of what this place was once like continues to grow. It shouldn't necessarily be a surprise that the Kamela Hetton site has proven fruitful for archaeologists. It is, after all, situated in Luxor, which in ancient times was known as Thebes. As the one-time capital of ancient Egypt, this city was a hub of activity, and the signs of that are still evident today. Modern Luxor has frequently been called the world's greatest open-air museum, and for good reason. The place is absolutely littered with some of the most well-known ruins in all of Egypt. This has made it a great source of interest, not only for scholars, but for everyday tourists, too. When it was known as Thebes, the city was among the greatest centers in all of ancient Egypt. The New Kingdom period of history was probably its heyday, which spanned from about 1570 BC to 1069 BC. Around this time, Thebes was closely tied to the worship of the deity known as Amun. Thebes was raised along the river Nile, with some extremely significant temples springing into being there. Perhaps the most famous of these is Karnak, the ruins of which can still be marveled at today. This complex was among the largest religious sites on Earth for its time, spanning roughly 300 acres. Karnak was the most important sacred hub in the Egyptian New Kingdom, so the ruins there are naturally very impressive. Some of them, in fact, are absolutely huge. Hatshepsut's obelisk, for instance, is a tower that extends some 90 feet into the air, while the rest of the site is littered with a range of similarly imposing pillars and statues. Connected to Karnak via an almost 2-mile-long boulevard was another impressive structure known as Luxor Temple. This channel was overlooked by a line of stone sphinxes, beasts with human heads and lion bodies. The core of Luxor Temple was raised when Amenhotep III and Ramesses II were in power, but pharaohs after them also added features. The Temple of Luxor was built in tribute to the deity Amun. According to historians, the structure was once used for a special event known as the Opulent Festival. The site held a huge significance for people in ancient Egypt, but it's actually retained this importance to the present day. A mosque known as Abu el-Haggag was built there during the 1200s and is still active now. So far, we've been looking only at the parts of Thebes built to the east of the Nile. In the parts of the city situated on the west bank, though, things were a bit different. This was a district dominated by structures built for the dead. Basically, it consisted of a series of elaborate tombs housing deceased elites. The people who ruled over ancient Egypt would be laid to rest in these spaces under the ground. These chambers would be adorned in fine decorations and absolutely filled with riches. They were, in short, tombs fit for the elaborate tastes of kings and queens, even if they had passed on. Probably the most famous pharaoh to be interned in this area is Tutankhamun, whose resting place was famously excavated there in 1922. Many of the other tombs in the area had been looted through the centuries, but Tutankhamun's spot was left basically untouched. That's allowed us to get a really vivid idea of what the ancient Egyptians did with the remains of their dead leaders. Thebes was also home to the Valley of the Queens, which we know holds around 90 tombs of prominent figures of the New Kingdom. Obviously, queens were buried here, but so too were princes and other elites. Sadly, a lot of looting took place here as well, so we don't have as much detail as we otherwise might have. Perhaps the greatest feature of ancient Thebes, though, was Kamela Hetton, the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, and once the most vast sacred site on the planet. Still, as previously mentioned, until recently we didn't know terribly much about it because experts thought much of the temple had been lost to the ravages of time. For a long time, modern archaeologists were under the assumption that the only things of note still on the site were a pair of massive statues. Standing tall at the entry point to the old temple, these two figures are known as the Colossi of Memnon. But aside from those impressive artifacts, little else was thought to have remained. But in 1996 things started to change. That year a wildfire broke out on the site, which worried one pair of important archaeologists in particular. This was married couple Haurig Sauruzian and Rainer Statelmann. When these two saw the damage caused by the inferno, they knew they needed to do something. Dr. Sauruzian began lobbying to get the site protected status, which she achieved in 1998. This basically meant that a certain amount of funding was procured to help the archaeologists preserve the area and its artifacts. It was while doing this work that the academics started to get an inkling that there was more to the site than initially met the eye. It didn't take long before the funding the couple had managed to secure had dried up, which meant their work was winding down by 2000. But after one rich French lady heard Dr. Sauruzian speak in a lecture in Paris, she wanted to chip in. This enthusiast paid for more excavations to take place, and these works would prove remarkably fruitful. Now, the true significance of Amenhotep III's temple site started to become evident. Where once archaeologists had focused primarily on places such as the Luxor and Karnak temples, now their attention switched. This site arguably contained more riches and wonders than any other, and it was all starting to be uncovered thanks to Dr. Sauruzian and Dr. Statelmann and their sponsor. The pharaoh known as Amenhotep III is considered to have been one of the greatest pharaohs of all. During his reign, generally characterized as both peaceful and prosperous, Egyptian civilization hit something of a high point. Amenhotep III oversaw a great deal of development throughout his kingdom, which is maybe epitomized most eloquently by the now ruined Kamela Hetton. He clearly held great affection for this place, apparently referring to it as a fortress of eternity out of good white sandstone worked with gold throughout. Well, Fortress of Eternity is certainly an impressive title. Amenhotep III managed to build all these things because of the relative peace he brought to his kingdom. This atmosphere of calm led to a boost in trade, which meant wealth flooded into Egypt. With these newfound riches, the pharaoh set out on a project to adorn his kingdom with signature works of artistic splendor. With the artistically minded Amenhotep in power, creatives of the civilization were able to experiment. It was a thriving time for the art world, as Betsy Bryan of Johns Hopkins University remarked in a Smithsonian Magazine piece from 2007. Amenhotep's era, she said, was probably the highest quality art Egypt ever made. The man had taste. The greatest projects of Amenhotep's reign took place in Thebes, the home of the pharaoh himself. Leaders before him had tended to spend their time in the city of Memphis, but Amenhotep liked being in his home city more. And with his attention firmly on Thebes, he completely transformed the place. Amenhotep left his mark on the Luxor and Karnak temples, with new constructions built onto the existing sites. But his crowning achievement was probably in the construction of his own mortuary complex, which covered a vast space roughly equivalent to Vatican City today. This was Kamela Hetton. In its day, Kamela Hetton would have been a spectacular sight to behold. But time did much to degrade its one-time glory, with natural disasters and scavenging, ensuring the site was unrecognizable in the centuries after Amenhotep's passing. It was only under Dr. Sauruzian and Dr. Stadelman's watch that some of the place's true grandeur was rediscovered. By 2007, Dr. Sauruzian and Dr. Stadelman's excavations had unearthed some amazing things at the site. Sandstone pillars were discovered, as were statues depicting Amenhotep III himself. There were also statues shaped like hippos, crocodiles, and representations of the deity known as Sekhmet, who took the form of a woman with the head of a lion. Sekhmet was clearly of particular interest for Amenhotep III, as there were apparently 730 such statues raised at his temple. Why all the interest? Well, Sekhmet was thought to guard a pharaoh's power, so it's no real surprise Amenhotep was so keen to have her present at his tomb complex. Dr. Sauruzian and Dr. Stadelman's archaeological project at Kamela Hetton led to some great discoveries. And work has continued there through the years, with some major finds still being made. Come January 2022, for instance, some exciting news was coming out of the site. Archaeologists had found some oddly shaped artifacts inside the temple. So, what were these discoveries? Well, they were basically statues depicting Amenhotep III, but they took an odd form. Rather than presenting him as a man, these things showed him as a sphinx, with the body of a lion and the head of a man. He was wearing headwear shaped like a mongoose and wore a beard on his face. Archaeologists also managed to uncover some more of the hundreds of Sekhmet statues that had been laid out on the site. Plans are now in place for these artifacts to join the other Sekhmet sculptures uncovered over the years. They'll all be put on display with one another in their rightful places on the temple site. Sarosian was the head of this particular project, rather than Dr. Sauruzian or Dr. Stadelman. According to Dr. Sarosian, the particular spot where the big Amenhotep sphinxes were found is quite telling. As the expert sees it, the location suggests the statues were used to line an avenue which would have been passed along during festivals. The sphinxes were subjected to restorative works after their discovery, with specialists cleaning them up a bit. It was during this process that something was noted on the chest of the sphinx. Words that translate to the beloved of the god Amun-Re were inscribed there, a reference to the sun deity. All in all, discoveries like this are providing us with a more vivid idea of what life was like at the time of Amenhotep III. For so long his temple was obscured from view, but with the work of experts it's now coming to light. Bit by bit, we're starting to really see the grandeur of Amenhotep's period. Works have now been taking place on the site of Kamela Hetton for well over 2 decades. In that time, of course, some amazing artifacts have been found. But as this most recent batch of discoveries has indicated, there's probably plenty more to discover there. Speaking to Smithsonian as far back as 2007, Dr. Sauruzian acknowledged how difficult excavations would be on the site, but emphasized their importance. She said, "You would need years and millions of dollars to excavate. What's more urgent is to save the statues, preserve the last remains of the temple, and present it with dignity." Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.